So you want to dive into this thing?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, welcome to For the Record, which is a conversation series where we speak with all manner of music heads about their stories and the music that makes them. Um, with all of these, just kind of like to start at the beginning,
Mhm.
and hear about your story and your path, when your relationship with music started, and, work our way from there.
All right. My name's Ben Stidel, from the San Francisco area. And I mean, my music path started at birth practically. My parents were musicians. They were in like a top 40 cover band that played weddings and
Cool.
nightclubs and stuff in the 80s. So I grew up with, in my dad was like also a jazz
My dad
head
was
and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, there was just music in the house all the time growing up as a kid. Um, in high school, I got into alternative rock in the 90s, had a crappy garage band, all that stuff. In college, got into wider music stuff. My tastes expanded. I started working at Amoeba when I was 19,
Cool.
and that was a huge trip. I played in some other bands, rock bands. I played in a screamy hardcore band for years, like toured the world with the screamy DIY hardcore band. Um, in the mid 2000s, I started a band with two other guys called Lemonade, which was more like dance music influence, um, among other things. And around that time, we also started DJing. It was kind of that era where if you're in a band that plays dancey music, it's like the band does a DJ set kind of thing.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so did a lot of that. And we as a band moved to New York in 2008. Continued. I was working at Amoeba the whole time in SF, and then worked at a record store here for a while, and then started my own record store, the first store we had, in 2011, and just continued DJing, continued playing music. Yeah, that's kind of all I do.
Amazing. Yeah, it sounds like it's been music through and through.
Yeah, for sure.
Um, yeah, that's awesome. I'm curious going back like to the early days and hearing a little bit about like, what was the main repertoire, of your parents, they're like
Um,
a top 40 cover band.
yeah, so they were a wedding band essentially. They also had
Mm.
like a gig at the nightclub at the top of the San Francisco Hilton, and they played at country clubs and stuff like that. And they did top 40 from every decade, which meant everything from, In the Mood or whatever, to whatever was contemporary. And this was like the early to mid 80s. So, it was whatever was in the charts kind of thing they were playing. My dad would make me like mixtapes of songs that they were learning essentially. And it would be like, Starship and Tears for Fears and
Cool.
whatever, all that kind of stuff. And Michael Jackson, and I was really into Michael Jackson when I was little.
Mhm.
And Weird Al.
Oh, nice. Cool. And so I imagine you started playing instruments like pretty young.
Yeah, I mean, I dabbled here and there. I was in like the school band. I was in choir. I started playing guitar in probably the mid 90s when I was in high school. And, it was kind of like I didn't have music that was mine until Nirvana, and Pearl Jam and that kind of stuff. And then I was like, oh, I want to be in an alternative rock band or whatever. And yeah, so I played guitar for a long time. And then um, the whole thing with the hardcore band, which was like early 2000s, they asked me to fill in like super last minute on a tour playing bass, which I'd never played before. But I was like, well, I play guitar. I can probably figure it out. And I did that, and then ended up staying in that band for years and touring all over the world and stuff like that.
Cool. That's amazing. And when did like, I'm curious hearing about like your first days like working at Amoeba. Like, were you already collecting records at this point? Like, was that a passion already?
I mean,
And
I
like,
was collecting CDs at the
I,
time.
yeah, right.
And yeah, I was 19. It was my second year of college. I wanted a part-time job. Amoeba was it's a huge store. It was a huge staff, but
Yeah.
also it was like, how are you going to get a job there? But I had a friend's brother worked there, and also my guitar teacher from when I was like 13, 14 worked there. And between
Cool.
them, got me an interview. I acted like I knew my shit, and I absolutely did not. And was schooled very quickly, but they gave me this job where it's insane that this job existed, but there were people working there who all you did all day was switch out old jewel cases on CDs.
Hmm.
So they would buy used CDs, and if the case was cracked or the case was dirty or scuffed up, you would switch it, and you were a case switcher. And there were like four people working at a time doing this. And you just do this all day, which sounds miserable, but actually, I would just sit there with my Discman with the
Yeah.
entire library of Amoeba at my fingertips.
Wow.
And on top of that, having this like incredible staff of like anything you wanted to know about, there was somebody there that was an expert. So it's like, I want to know about free jazz or Merzbow or African music. There was like a specialist who could give you recommendations and stuff like that. So it was just really an amazing education. But I didn't really, at some point I was like, oh, CDs, lame. I can just burn all my CDs and start buying records. Those are cooler,
Mm.
which I did. But I wasn't really working with records. It was this amazing music education. But as far as the like minutia of record buying and record store stuff and vinyl, I didn't really learn the real stuff about that until I moved to New York and started working at Academy.
Hmm. And then
But
what?
oh,
No,
go ahead.
no, no, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh no, I've already lost it.
Well, I was just gonna ask, kind of prompt for like what were some of the insights? Like once you moved to New York and you started working at Academy, like what, how is that different from Amoeba? What were the things that you hadn't learned yet that like started to expand that world for you?
Well, Amoeba was this huge store. I mean, and this was when I was working there. I mean, I worked there during the com boom.
Hmm.
And it was peak CD. It was just rammed with people spending so much money on CDs, and there was this huge staff, and it was really compartmentalized. So I worked there for almost 10 years. I didn't do case switching the entire time, but it was like I ended up in the ad office for a while, like booking advertising in local weekly papers and also helping set up and promote in-store performances. And then I also spent some time when they started doing an eBay store, that kind of stuff. But it was very like, this is your one job. You're not you're not going to spend 2 hours pricing records or something like that.
Right.
And then moving to New York and working at Academy, it's a much smaller store, it's a much smaller staff, and you do a little bit of everything.
Right.
Um, and when I started there was nobody really there. I was kind of the only person on staff into dance music, and they were like, very quickly, it was like, congratulations, you're the dance music buyer. And I was like, I don't know what I'm doing at all, but I'm gonna figure it out. And just being around people who knew the stuff, learning about how to spot first pressings of things and reissues and all of the like just minutia of records, like the objects. I feel like I was already very knowledgeable about music, but I didn't actually know much about records and record collecting and that kind of stuff. But picked that up very quickly, kind of out of necessity.
Hmm. Um, I'm curious. You mentioned that you were responsible for booking a lot of, like the in-store performances and stuff in me. But I'm curious if there are like, two or three, two or three acts that were particularly memorable for you.
Yeah. Number one, like highlight was being able, I don't know if you've been to the Amoeba in San Francisco, but there's a big stage. It's not like a little corner where people are sitting strumming a guitar. It's a full on stage, and like we had Sonic Youth, and I got to be the one go out on stage and introducing the band, which was pretty crazy, and it was absolutely packed, as you can imagine. That was cool. Funnily enough, I just have a very distinct memory of the Killers playing, and they hadn't really broken yet, and there was kind of nobody there for them. But they were super nice, and I mean, it's the Killers. I'm not a huge fan, but you know, it's just this funny memory that lingers with me of this band that went on to be festival headliners, and I was kind of like, ugh, I feel bad about the turnout, you know?
Yeah.
And then I don't know, like around that time when the label Def Jux was really big, the hip hop label, and Cannibal Ox and LP performed, and just like, I mean, that Cannibal Ox record is so good, and the LP production from that period and his solo stuff, and I was a big Company Flow fan, and just getting to see them just rip it up on stage was super memorable.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, and then, you know, so you're in New York now, and then you're starting to learn the minutia of you know, these like musical objects, and you know how they work. I'm curious, like, you know, what were some of the things when you were tasked with, you know, being the dance music buyer? Like, what were some of the things that you know, who were some of the artists that you first started to buy and bring into the store?
You know, it was mostly the used buyer. I mean, I was ordering new stuff, but when I talk about that, it's a lot more about like, you know, New York. It's like disco and house music and stuff that you would see in San Francisco, but it was a very different kind of breed of these collections coming in, where it was like somebody's got every Sol Soul promo, and you know, West End and all of these like classic New York labels are just like mountains of Strictly Rhythm and Nervous records, and you know, at the time I knew about house music, I knew about disco, there were songs and tracks I liked, but I didn't know how to spot the rare stuff or the super desirable stuff. I didn't know a lot at the time, and you know, kind of through trial and error, I really started absorbing a lot of that info.
Yeah, I mean, what are the things you did to absorb it? Like, I'm curious how this is like pre-Discogs, I imagine. Like, how you know, like, were you?
No, it wasn't nearly as huge of a tool,
you know, able
but
to learn like how to spot the rarities.
yeah, I mean, I would buy collections, and a lot of times I would be kind of eyeballing it, and you know, sometimes it was like, I remember I bought one really big collection, you know, and the guy kind of hustled me, you know, because it was like, I've got, you know, I'm an old school DJ, I won't name names, but he is real guy and producer, and it was like, I've got all the Prelude stuff and all the salsa stuff and all this house stuff, and I was like, oh man, this sounds awesome. And you know, it was one of those collections where you're not going piece by piece because it's like 6,000 records or something like that. But I was like, well, there's got to be bangers in here, you know, and I kind of eyeballed it, and upon starting to price it and starting to look things up, I'm like, oh, he like already cherry picked this for the good stuff. You know, and again, it wasn't like the end of the world, but I was also like, oh, I really, you know, need to pay closer attention or need to learn a little bit more, you know, and whatever. Ultimately, sell a lot of cheap records, and it's fine to have a bunch of cheapies. People love it, but it was really like a reminder of how little I still knew at that point, I think.
And then, you know, how did it come to be that you decided to you know, start your own? Yes.
You know, it's a couple guys that I worked with at Academy who had left, and I was still there, and I was kind of de facto managing the store. This was when it was in Williamsburg on North 6th Street. And they had left. I mean, it's a very long, I will give the short version of this story because it's kind of long and not that interesting, but they basically had this space. I don't know if you know the record label Mexican Summer.
Yeah, sure.
and they're in Greenpoint on Guernsey Street. They have their offices there, and they had built this little record store with this kind of goal of it being like a boutique for their label and some other labels. There were some other labels in the building at the time, and it was going to be all like new stuff, new local Brooklyn indie kind of stuff. And that kind of had run its course a little bit, or just they were like, this is not really like working out the way we'd envisioned. Whatever, they kind of, so one of the other guys who I had worked with at Academy was like, they've got this record store built already. I'm like, would you guys be interested in taking over the space? And I was still working at Academy, but I was like, yes, but I need to keep working until it's ready to open, basically. So I was working there, and kind of off hours collectively built this record store. I mean, it was already physically built, but made it like a record store with used records and secondhand stuff and all of that. And yeah, that was called Co-op 87. We opened our version of that in 2011, and ran that for till 2019, when we opened our Bushwick store and kind of restructured the business a little bit as well. Mexican Summer are now actually partners in the business.
Okay.
Opened, one of the original guys left, but opened this Bushwick store and kind of rebranded as Brooklyn Record Exchange, planning to very quickly remodel and reopen the Greenpoint space as well. And then this was 2019, then COVID happened and it stalled for a couple of years, but we've now got both stores up and running.
Cool. That's awesome. I'm curious to hear what the evolution has been like, especially like when you first opened that in 2011, kind of around like the emergence of Spotify and more of the prevalence of streaming. And I'm curious how the business has changed. I'm curious, like from the business perspective, and also from your perspective as like a crate digger and music discoverer, how it changed for you, if at all.
It's funny because the record stores, I mean, yes, streaming changed things, but there's always record collectors. It's not like there was this huge like, oh, people aren't buying records anymore, because most people already weren't buying records. Like, record collecting was still niche, it was still, your average music fan went from buying CDs to buying downloads to streaming, and the people who were buying records the whole time didn't stop buying records because Spotify existed. So I can't say I saw a huge change. If anything, the catalyst for changing the feel of things is Record Store Day and the major labels getting into the reissue game and prices going up and all of that stuff. And suddenly you can buy records at Target and Urban Outfitters and stuff like that. Which, people like real heads clown on that stuff, but at the same time, like, that gets kids into records, and I can't be mad about that. I have my own opinions about Record Store Day, but if 20% of the people who are really excited about the brand new stupid Record Store Day release stick around in the game, then that's good for me in the long term.
Yeah, totally. I'm curious how much you stream music personally.
I don't really.
Cool.
I mean, I don't have a Spotify account, or I do, but I don't have like the app or anything on my phone. I stream on, what I do? I really love Bandcamp. I dig a lot on Bandcamp. I think it's incredible. And I do use, I wish it was a better interface, but I do stream music off Bandcamp that I've purchased. And I do, sometimes we'll check out stuff before I purchase it on Bandcamp or whatnot. But I have, MP3s on my phone still and whatever. I'm not anti-streaming. I think it's the future. I'm not gonna like yell at the cloud about that. But it's just, as far as Spotify goes, I pick my battles, and I really think it's a terrible company for music. And whatever. I use Amazon. They're also a terrible company for the world. but that's just like it's too personal for me. I can't mess with it, you know.
Yeah.
And I buy music, I download music. It's not like I'm like, oh, I don't have anything to listen to today. So I just don't really need it. But I also don't fault people for using it because it's like, yeah, you've got like all the music in the world at your fingertips for next to nothing. Like what? I'm not going to fault the consumer for that, you know?
Yeah, yeah, totally. It's not the consumer's fault, but yeah, we're gonna have to have, kind of a paradigm shift, I think, if we ever want to leave that, this level of convenience behind. But
Yeah.
you,
It shouldn't be that cheap. Like, you
yeah,
know,
it doesn't make
it
any
just,
sense. to be
yeah.
that cheap.
Like I used
Like,
to pay $16, $17 for a new CD, one new CD, you know?
yeah,
And like, yeah,
yeah. Now it's
it's,
like half that price for all the music in the world for an entire month.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's pretty fucked up. But it's cool. I haven't, it's not often that I speak to people who like, don't stream music at all, but are, listen to music as much as you do. So, that's awesome. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Cool. Now I have a couple like more, music sort of specific questions for you.
All right.
Uh, who are three artists of note that you've heard for the first time in the past year?
Okay. There's a new record on Mexican Summer, and I'll say that like we're partners with the label, but I don't always even check out everything they put out too much. But this woman Jess Williamson, who made a couple records that I didn't really clock. They were kind of just sort of moody and folky, and her new record is like super pop kind of country,
Huh?
which sounds a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but I love it.
Cool.
I'm at my heart, I have a deep love of pop music, and
Mm.
it was just like out of left field. I was like, whoa, I just am listening to this all the time. So that was a recent one. Trying to think. Um, I do a lot of digging on Bandcamp, especially for like my radio show on the lot and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And it's cool because there's tons of artists releasing stuff that they're not on vinyl. I wouldn't encounter them in the shop or whatever. But there's an producer from South Africa called Tiro. It's Tiro exclamation point. And it's kind of some of it might get characterized as like lo-fi house or whatever, but it's not that lo-fi, and it's just I was like, oh, like every time I get an alert, I'm like, this is great. I love it. I'm buying it.
Yeah.
It's got a good sense of melody. It works on the dance floor. It's just really a cool producer. And another producer, local guy who I've known as a customer for a long time, produces music as SPF 50.
Oh, cool,
Um,
man.
and it's like very kind of typically pretty up-tempo, techy, like almost IDM-ish at times, but
Mhm.
dance music. I mean, it's definitely rooted in techno and house, but really like he's got some production chops, and so we stock his records, and yeah, they're always good. So there you
Cool.
go.
Cool. Good trail.
Yeah.
All right. Who's the most underappreciated artist from your favorite music decade?
Okay. I don't know what my favorite music decade is, but I would say lately I'm listening to a lot of 80s music and kind
Mhm.
of digging past the bigger names, especially in the like synth pop world, or just realizing like, oh, like Wang Chung are also actually awesome, and like they're not just about the singles or whatever.
Mhm.
But there's a band called New Music, which Musik. And they're like a British sort of synth pop band. They didn't really release the albums in the US. I think there was just a compilation that came out in the States, but they made 3 albums. They're very like weird, kind of quirky, but super pop new wave, but the production is like really unique. The guy from that band also produced that band Naked Eyes, who are another one of those kind of,
Mhm.
considered one hit wonders, but actually great '80s bands. But new music, yeah, their 3 albums are all awesome. They're super weird. There's almost like sometimes it almost reminds me of ELO or something, or like the bridge
Cool.
between that era and like the synth pop era.
Hmm.
But yeah, really, really love that band, and definitely a bit slept on.
Okay, cool. Um, who is like a music community, or what is the music community that you are particularly fond of, whether it's, like a collective or label or, another record, shop?
I guess this is maybe a little broad of an answer, but it's not a super defined community, but the like record store scene in New York
Mm.
of people who work there and the like really hardcore regulars who go to every record store like every week, and everybody
Cool.
knows each other, and
Cool.
maybe we don't all socialize together. It's like I don't have your phone number, but it's like this kind of, I know all these people that work at these other shops, and I see them and run into them, and we shop at each other's shops. And then also these regulars who just are practically part of the team. There's something really nice about it. It does feel like a bit of a community of just like these people I've known for years of my life and spent hours talking to, who have, no like connection outside of the record store. But once we're all in the record store, we're all buddies. And I
Yeah,
think that's cool.
cool. No, I love that. Um, is there like, one record sort of like your elusive, whatever find that you're always on the look for, but you haven't been able to come across or something?
I'm gonna say no, and that's weird, I know, but like, if anything, I mean, I have most of my desert island discs I own, um, but a lot of the kind of like intense collectory aspects of records, I think working in and owning stores, a lot of that is kind of past. Like, I don't have quite that urge that I need to own everything that I love,
Hmm.
or that there are records that I would be stoked if I saw an original come through, but I'm not desperate for anything.
Hmm.
And there's also this like, I'll see it one day. It
Yeah.
doesn't need to happen this year or next year. One day I'll have it, and that's fine. But I'm not like,
Yeah.
I'm not waiting for that Discogs alert to pop up. I'm not like going into all the other stores like telling them to be on the lookout. There's just nothing, strangely nothing like that for me at this point in my life.
Cool. I mean, that's probably a healthier take than like
I,
being desperate, for a record somewhere.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Um. uh. Cool. Okay, and then yeah, I think one more question for you.
All right.
You're going to a desert island, and you get to bring 3 records with you. What are they?
All right. The old desert island disc. I admit I did a little homework on these questions. I watched Lauren's episodes. I kind of like
Okay.
prepared a little bit. Number one would really have to be Smashing Pumpkins' Siamese Dream. It was my favorite
Nice.
record as a teenager. It stayed with me. I think as far as like my own musicality as a musician, just like the level of melody and density, and I don't know if I heard it for the first time today I would love it as much. It's so hard to disconnect from a record you've spent that much time with, because when you're a teenager you just listen to things over and over and over and over again.
Totally.
But that's always got to be there. Number two is a record by McCoy Tyner, who was like a jazz pianist, who worked with John Coltrane a lot, called Extensions. It's not like considered a holy grail classic or anything, but it's kind of my favorite jazz record. It's like,
Cool.
it's Tyner, who's this incredible pianist, and Elvin Jones drumming, who's like the best jazz drummer, and Alice Coltrane plays harp on it.
Sweet.
Uh, Gary Bartz on sax. It's kind of a bigger group. It's 4 tracks. It's just super dense, like spiritual jazz. It's not too out and abrasive, and I could just kind of listen to it all day. It was kind of something I came upon early and just always stayed with me. I just love that record so much. And then number 3 would be Bjork Homogenic,
Nice.
which was, it's interesting because I think Bjork was really like weirdly marketed in the US towards like alternative music in the 90s. So it was like you'd watch, the alternative show on MTV and it'd be like Helmet and Nirvana and then Bjork. They were like, the rock kids will love this like weird electronic dance music with this quirky vocalist. But so I got, exposed to that really early, and it was really the first electronic or dance music oriented stuff I ever heard. And again, as a teenager, I just like hammered it and listened to it constantly. So the first 3 Bjork records really were huge for me, but Homogenic is just like tops. The production on that is mostly by Mark Bell, who was in the group LFO, who were like an early Warp Records thing, amazing group. But the production is so crazy good. The songs are great. It's just like a perfect record. And it really was kind of my first glimpse at electronic dance music, which became a huge thing for me later in life.
Cool. I think that, is a good trio of records to bring to an island. Very eclectic.
I think I could hang with that for a while.
Yeah. You're the second person to pick a Smashing Pumpkins album. Actually, Mark, who is in the audience, he chose Melancholy.
All right.
Is bringing
also
that.
A great record. Yeah.
Cool. And then, anyone else come to mind who is, part of your community who, would be a great guest to come onto the show?
This guy, Max Reed, who he's a friend. He produces as Max in the World, and he runs a small dance label called Bliss Point. And he worked for Mexican Summer for a long time. He works for Domino now. So yeah, he's got like label world, production world, DJ world. Sorry, I've got a customer at the door. I gotta run.
Oh yeah, no worries. Yeah. That's a good spot to end anyways.
All right. But happy to send an intro for that.
Okay, awesome. All Thanks so much, man. This was great.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right, man. Take care.